to our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training. It is Wednesday, June 22nd. We're beginning at 5:33 p.m. I do know that Directors Geisinger and Whitmore will not be able to be in attendance with us tonight. I have not heard from anyone else about being absent, so hopefully people will come in as they're available. This training was put together in-house. This is the in-house training that RTD provides through its Civil Rights Department and gives to all RTD employees. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to have a different take and a different view of this training and see if we can get some more, more information. So this is going to be done by our very own Carl Green, who will be walking us through this training. And Mr. Green, we thank you very much for taking your time to provide this training for us, the Board of Directors. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
So good evening, Chair Busick and fellow RTD Board of Directors. Again, my name is Carl Green Jr. And with me tonight that will be leading the exercises is our Civil Rights Outreach Specialist, Vivian Morales. So at this point in time, I will go ahead and pull up the slides. All right, so to get us started, I just wanted to say I'm really excited to be here tonight to be able to deliver this workshop on equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I just wanted to state, as stated in the board packet, dating back to January 2021, the board adopted a recommended action regarding members' commitment to participate in a series of workshops structured to assist the board in operating from a common understanding of what equity means, building trust through working through identity-related work, and lastly, being able to authentically engage in using justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion lenses when approaching RTD strategy and vision. So as you all are very familiar, upon conclusion of that third-party consultant, we went back to the drawing board, and by direction of our general manager and CEO, Deborah Johnson, she recommended that staff from the Civil Rights Division lead these training sessions with a renewed emphasis on equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So when I was, as y'all know, our previous director, Kathleen Grove, she left the agency for another company on June 10th, and she brought to my attention that there's going to be an upcoming workshop to the board, and she presented that to me on June 8th, and I immediately said yes, because this is a momentous opportunity to engage with you all on this journey as we continue to, so to speak, tend to the land. And when we think about equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, these are key lenses or imperatives that must be cultivated, nurtured, and tended to for growth and ultimately sustainability. So as far as the workshop agenda or what to expect, we will be covering down on the why and what that means. We'll be going over meeting agreements, an overview of equity, diversity, and belonging to provide that framework. We will go through some exercises and provide some conceptual ideas and definition on awareness, as well as wrapping up with perspective. So before we actually begin the workshop, I wanted to provide an introduction and then also pass it over to Vivian to provide her introduction. So just taking, as we think about an onion peel and we're peeling back the lenses of, or the peel of what makes this person and what affords the opportunity to be able to present on such rich topics and conversations as it relates to the topic or this work session. So my introduction centers on my upbringing that's rooted me, my experiences that shaped me, and a passion of mine that continues to stretch me in the best of ways. My multicultural background sets the stage. My mother is Filipino with a sprinkle of Spanish, and my dad is African American and Puerto Rican. I am the son of a mother who raised 4 children who at the time didn't speak very good English, who work multiple jobs, but would still be faced with the harsh realities of being very low income and essentially in poverty. I'm the first out of my siblings to graduate high school and the first of my family to go to college. This provided me with observations and firsthand lived experiences of what it means to be from a marginalized community and/or disadvantaged group. And on a secondary note, it also provided me with an initial lens of how I show up in the world and how to navigate within and outside of the systems before me. My experience with diversity and inclusion dates back to 2006. I recall participating in countless workshops and trainings in the community, undertaking a fellowship at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where my first take at the job was how do we diversify the audience, and developing a strategy around that, to taking on opportunities to apply these principles in my academic courses and focusing my undergraduate and graduate degrees on leadership, diversity, and organizational development. Flash forward to 2011, this would mark the year where I was afforded the opportunity to really get into the work, so to speak, and get paid for this type of work through the military, where I was able to expand my lens and my knowledge base on civil rights, social justice, and equity. So again, to that point, I was able to take on various roles, both within the military and in the community on a volunteer and paid basis. So again, flash forward to 2015, and I won't go through the resume, if you will, but flash forward to 2015 as it relates to when I arrived in public transportation at TriMet, which was my previous agency that I was at, where I served as the senior program administrator for Title VI and equity programs. So I too, like many others, have evolved, and it's a iterative process when we think about this journey into equity, diversity, and inclusion. I made mistakes along the way, but I pushed forward, and because I knew the importance of this work, whether it stems from my background or what makes me tick and what my purpose in life or my life's work's all about. And when I knew better, I did better. So again, we're all at different stages or starting blocks, if you will, and that's okay. But the point to take away here is it's just so long that we finish together. So with that being said, I want to pass it over to Vivian to provide her introduction.
Thank you, Carl, and good evening, everybody. Like he said, my name is Vivian Morales. I currently serve as the Civil Rights Outreach Specialist here at RTD. I've been at RTD since 2014, where I stumbled into a career in transit. I've been with the Civil Rights Division since 2018. And my career spans over 25 years in nonprofit program management, and I've done that in Puerto Rico, in the Chicago area, and in Denver as well. I was 23 years old when I graduated college after 6 years and a double major, and I went over to the Chicago area to work on my degree, and I was suddenly very aware that I was very different in a land that didn't look like me very much. So through the years, I have learned how to put into language my experiences from those years, and like pretty much like Carl said, we keep growing, we keep evolving, and a lot of the program management that I did have done through my career has to do with leadership development. So that really at its core, you cannot have a leadership conversation without talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Educationally, I hold a Master's of Arts in Transformational Leadership, which focuses in specifically just that, nonprofit program management. And I've been at RTD for quite a bit. So I've done the Leadership Academy and the InnoMax program. And this year, I'm very honored to be one of the co-facilitators for the InnoMax program. Back to you, Carl.
Thank you, teammate. All right, so just to go over the meeting agreements, this sets the tone, if you will, as we navigate through this workshop. And it's, so to speak, to provide that platform or set the stage of what we're hoping to come out of this workshop. So again, it's okay to make mistakes, to respect others' differences, to speak for yourself, and to ask questions and to participate. So what you put in is what you get out. So a first step in that, and I see some folks here tonight has turned on their camera. So if you haven't, please feel free to turn on that switch to turn your camera on. And then it's okay to feel uncomfortable. Having these conversations can be comfortable, but how do we move through it together is top of mind to get us to be able to get more comfortable. The more proactive that we are, the more ubiquitous conversations that we have is if we think about it from a spectrum of how comfortable you are, we will grow together to make sure that we're able to move through that uncomfortable state. And then if needed, we will take a short break if needed. And before I continue, I will call on Director Lewis as she has her hand up.
Hi, Mr. Green. I actually have COVID, and so I'm not on camera because I feel terrible. And so I'd asked my colleagues if it would be all right if I stayed off camera for the duration of this. I am engaged. I just feel like crap.
Sorry to hear, Director Lewis. No fun. It doesn't sound very fun.
Hey, thank you.
All right, so as this slide shows, it's RTD's why. So whatever emotion we're after, whatever goal we decide to pursue, whether it's serving on the RTD board, working in the public sector, or committing to our respective life's work, there are universal needs that makes us tick and drive all human behavior. There's needs such as significance, love and connection, variety, growth, and contribution. These needs influence our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions. So when we think about RTD's why, it's what, and this is something that drives us together for that common goal and purpose. It's embedded within our vision to be a trusted leader in mobility, delivering excellence and value to our customers and community. Our why as it relates to our mission, as we make lives better through connections, and also rooted in our values of passion, respect, diversity, trustworthiness, collaboration, and ownership. As a governance board that is heavily involved in policymaking and setting the strategic direction for the agency, as you know, each board member plays a vital and instrumental role in operationalizing our vision, mission, and values. So with this slide, it's as we know what our collective purpose and our collective goals, this is an opportunity for the board to either take pen to paper or mentally think through this. But what is your why? What is your why to serving on the board? What is your why for your professions that you lead? So this is an opportunity, taking a minute or so to jot down or reflect what is your why. And then when we're in a good place, let's say a minute or so, where it would be great to have a couple of board members share their why. Director Williams.
Hi, Carl. How are you? I'm game to share my why if it now is the time.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so let's see. My father was a Marine drill instructor, and he was in public relations after he got out of the Marines. My mom was an English teacher. I'm one of 4 kids, and I have lived all over the country. I have a background in working with the disabled and older adults. I used to run a sports center for the disabled in Miami, Florida. I spent a number of years sailing around the world on a boat, and obviously at that, you don't get to have a car. So in many, many places in the world, I rode transit. And I am a transit nerd. I have a T-shirt on the wall behind me that says, I am a transit nerd. So I ran for the RTD board a number of years ago at the request of a number of people in the disability community. And I still work with those people on a regular basis. And I do this because I think that transit is our future. I think that everybody has to get out of their car and stop contributing to greenhouse gas and use public transit. I think that RTD is safe, clean, and mostly on time. And I took my bicycle on the bus today. So is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you for sharing.
Okay.
Director Davidson.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks for hosting this and doing this. Really appreciate the work that went into it. I'd be happy to share my why for serving on the board. I'm somebody who grew up with a tremendous amount of access, and in my career over the years, I've increasingly realized that collaboration is really the key to success in any business, any group, any club, any agency, and it's very true in the United States. I think we're at our strongest as a country, as a community, as neighborhoods, when everybody's working together. When we're in times when we're all ripped apart, we don't do so well. I think we all can relate to that and feel that. And the more that we come together, the better we do. So as I started to realize that, I started to learn a lot more about city design, about infrastructure design in this country, about how we had built some things and some of the lack of thought that went in, as well as some of the intentional thought that actually served to rip us apart. And in my career, I'm very passionate about sustainable systems. So I'm somebody who believes that government and agencies and services that serve us have to be around for a long time. We have to think about them very carefully. And so looking at my skill set, there was an opportunity to get involved here. But for me, transportation is one of the keys to bringing everybody together, whether it's accessing healthcare and the best healthcare you can get to, whether it's accessing entertainment, schools, all of these types of things. I started to really realize how hard it was to access a lot of the things that I had access to. And then I had the benefit of living in a lot of areas where you start to just take transit for granted. You use it to get everywhere, and you realize that it can actually be quite easy to access a lot of what society has to offer. So a number of people have been reaching out to me about with concerns in the area that I live in within Colorado about the long-term viability of RTD, and whether perception or whether reality. That got me very interested to see how I could deploy my skills to help and make sure that we increase access throughout the region, and that we make sure that RTD is going to be here today, tomorrow, and for the next 100 years at least. So, thanks.
Thank you for sharing. Next, we have Chair Busick.
Thanks, Carl. So I was raised in a transit-dependent family in inner city Chicago, North Side, Vivian, and we didn't even own a car. So that's all I knew. If you wanted to get somewhere, you rode your bike or you took transit. So I grew up knowing the importance of transit and what it could do. In Chicago, you could stand on almost any street corner and just wait, and a bus will come. So I remember moving to Denver 25 or 26 years ago. And one of the first things I wanted to do is, let's take the kids downtown or some event that was going on, and let's just figure out what the bus schedule is and where we get the bus. And we're in Broomfield, and the answer was no bus. So I was always, an issue for me. And I had subsequently served for 8 years on Broomfield City Council, and I was always interested in transit and trying to improve and increase the availability of transit, because I knew and know how it can enrich and improve lives. So that's kind of what got me going and continued always in the back of my mind. And then there was an opportunity to run for the board of directors here. And I thought, well, maybe this is my chance to try to make a difference in transit in this region. So that's my story. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, next we have Director Bouquet.
Thank you very much, Carl. Yeah, I think I'm going to take this kind of in two perspectives that kind of relate. because I work two jobs, being, you know, an RTD director, but a lot of my energy and focus does go to my day job as being a school teacher. And my original idea for running for the RTD board was I felt RTD board members should be writers, should be folks who actually use our system. And, you know, I felt I could offer a unique perspective with that, because I think that when it comes down to our system and us as a board of directors, it ultimately comes down to empathy. And that unites when it comes down to my day job as being a teacher, and that's being able to, you know, have some empathy for our students, understand where our students are coming from, understand where our writers and where our employees are coming from. And I think that's going to be, you know, the biggest perspective. And that was kind of my hope of being a board director, is ultimately having empathy and having compassion and having communication with all members of, you know, our very, very large community in the RTD system. And I think that's, you know, a huge skill, especially being a leader, is being able to, you know, not necessarily always be speaking, but doing a lot more listening. And, you know, hearing what our community is saying, hearing what our writers are saying, and hearing what our employees are saying. And ultimately, I always go through the perspective as being a full-time teacher of, you know, your job is to educate, but I always view it as building better human beings. That is my main goal as an educator, is to build better human beings. And, you know, my hope is, as a board director, after my time is served, is, have we made a better system? You know, have we made a better system? Have we been able to service our community, and ultimately walk away where folks, you know, who ride our system can look and say, oh, you know what, this board of directors and future board of directors are able to show the empathy to ultimately better our community.
Thank you so much. Director Giselle.
Thank you. I think, you know, for me, my why did I run? Why am I here? 5:30 on a Wednesday. For me, when I look back at why I did it, it's the biggest one was equity, and it really was. My sort of own journey in the equity space was started pretty publicly making a number of mistakes, which I would talk about in one next session. But as I went on to become an educator and prior to coming to private practice, you know, I realized the impact that transit has on communities, especially our most marginalized communities. Your ability to have a job, your ability to have healthcare, your ability to go to school, and for kids who are at Title I schools, that's also your ability to get fed, get to a grocery store. And so, you know, for me, it was really about, it started with kids and it was people within the ed space who encouraged me to run. And then it became about economics. I looked at the true cost of car ownership, and people estimate it's about $9,000 a year. And that is quick math, like $15 an hour, which I know some minimum wages are slightly higher, but $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. Well, that's $30,000 pre-tax, which means that you're spending a third of your post-tax dollars, right? It's probably more than a third of your income are getting around. Forget about if you wanted to live in a house or do anything else. And so transit became a big focus of mine. View it as a great equalizer. The other aspect is climate. Again, I think it's a great opportunity to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, to you know, build a better society. I think, you know, different people, you interact with lots of different people when you take public transit. In our system, especially when you take the bus versus train, the light rail. And I think we'd be a more, frankly, understanding and better society if more people took transit. Turns out you're all on the same bus. And you know, that was especially true during COVID and coming out of COVID. And it adds a lot of valuable perspective to see people in a routine sort of have this understanding of the take the zeros and say, 20 of us, 10 of us, see the same people sort of every day. Sort of have this neat little community. I think we'd be better as a society if we're sort of in those shared spaces more often.
Thank you so much, Director Deschelle. We'll move on with Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you for hosting us this evening for this important discussion. In response to the question, why am I here on the RTD board? I was transit dependent in high school. I spent 2 years riding the MTA in Los Angeles to get home at night from Loyola High, because if I didn't ride the bus, I couldn't participate in extracurricular activities, being in plays and things. And then I spent 2 years riding the DSR in Detroit for high school, because again, I needed to be able to participate in activities. And then I spent my first 2 years at College of Regis, and I used to ride Denver tramways back then. It was just before the RTD was formed, so that gives you an idea of how long ago that was. And it was a great opportunity to be able to get downtown and see things there. Then, when I was clerking for Chief Judge Raj as a newly minted lawyer, I had to take the bus from our home in Westminster down to Denver, because my wife needed the car because she was going to law school. And so it was an experience that really gave me a lot of appreciation for what buses mean. And that's why I care so much in particular about students riding the buses. My engagement in a full basis with transportation and transit really started in 2000, when I was on the Dr. Cog board as a council member here in Cherry Hills. That was an incredible education, and it is what led me to say yes when Director Kent Bagley asked me to run for his term limited seat. So I'm delighted to be here, and I retain that strong history of understanding that students in particular need to be able to use this to get around. And I've got a grandson who is starting middle school, and apparently next year, perhaps not this year, he's going to have to ride the bus to get from his home in Northfield to where his middle school is. So I'm still very focused on students riding the buses. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Director Tisdale. Do we have any others that would like to share? So it was either one of two things. I was going to sing a little song to say, what is your why? But we don't have to go there, because I appreciate everyone's participation and giving a little tidbit and a little snapshot on your why. But we also had Vivian, as a just in case, prepare her why. So if she would like to, I'd like to give her the space and time to offer her why.
Thank you, Carl. Absolutely. So just haphazardly throughout my career, I started volunteering, and it was something, just my career kind of fell in mesh with it needs, what I'm doing job-wise needs to make a difference in my community. It was just how I landed, and I just started working that way. And then after grad school for a couple of years, I was a little burnt out, so I decided that I was only going to do Starbucks. And after a couple of years of being a barista, I decided that, yeah, corporate is not for me. Private is not for me. It's great for so many people, and they were pushing me to move into management. And I said, thank you, I'll pass. I'll rather start temping and get back into the job hunt of something in a nonprofit again, because that's really where my passion is at. So RTD is a great fit, and I stumbled into my career in transit, and it's fulfilling because I am putting all my skill set into work, into serving the community. And that's really the why for me.
Thank you, Vivian. So just to circle back, I just wanted to say thank you all for providing your why. And just thinking about it's an opportunity to share, but also too, as I'm thinking about the why behind each board of directors why, is just thinking about when I was listening, it became apparent that we all value and we prioritize these needs. And there's, as we're weaving the needle, so to speak, on each director's response, things became paramount of why. So I just appreciate the opportunity, and that it's a privilege to be able to hear your why. And when I think about what's the driving force behind what we do, and it determines the direction of our lives, so to speak, and whether it's stemming from high school to traveling around the world, or why folks in your community, particular communities, asked you to serve, so to speak, to serve on the RTD board. And given our positions within RTD, it has a direct impact, as you know, on the communities that we serve. So again, thank you all for sharing your why.
Carl,
All right.
this is
Yes.
Chaishree. Director Catlin's on the attendee list because she joined by phone, but she has her hand up.
Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Director Catlin. I do apologize for joining late. We got a notice here that our internet Xfinity was down. It was supposed to be back up by 3 p.m. and now I got a notice that it will not be up until 10:30 tonight. So I'm joining by phone, and I was only able to hear about half of the director's stories, but I just wanted to let you know that I was on the line and very much appreciate what you're doing tonight. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Director Catlin. And if you care to share, I know this workshop is being recorded, so you'll have the opportunity to circle back on getting the full meal deal, if you will, on the other director's why. But if you care to share, please feel free to share your why as why you're serving on the board or whatnot.
Thank you, Carl. I was asked to fulfill a vacancy in 2018 early because of my experience in transportation in general and transit, a long history professionally. And so I did apply to fill that vacancy and have served then since March of 2018 and have really learned a lot, even though I had been involved with RTD and with CDOT and other transportation providers in the past. So this has been a very fulfilling experience, and I've understood what it means to be a director who looks at the entire district and try to represent my unique district that's kind of a transit desert while trying to balance the needs of the overall RTD district. So thank you all for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you so much, Director Catlin. All right, so growth mindset. This is something that I wanted to, it's a new slide that I wanted to add to this presentation. But as I think about growth mindset, and I'll read out for Director Catlin, but as the slide states, the human brain is an amazing thing. It's capable of adapting, expanding, and reshaping. In contrast, there's the fixed mindset, is when one believes they can't change or try new strategies. What we want to focus on is the growth mindset, where our mind is open to breaking outside of our assumptions. So just thinking about the why that y'all presented tonight, and there was an evolution, so to speak, of why you're serving on the board, or what information that you've gained or experience that you've gained throughout your years, whether it's on the RTD board or just your life's work of how you got to that point, or what led you to this point today. So there's some level of that growth mindset, but as we circle back and we start thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging, it's having that growth mindset to challenge those assumptions and generalizations to really begin to do the work. And depending on where you sit, it could take greater work, but the benefit is there's benefits and rewards to doing this work. So as far as these study session objectives, we're going to gain a shared language of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, what it means for awareness, social identities, bias. We'll then move forward, or throughout this workshop, is some practical application through exercises, and then being able to apply takeaways in your role. To operate from a common understanding of what equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging means, I like to provide some foundational definitions as well as point out that they are all interconnected. Moreover, it helps us define where we are, where we will be, and where we're collectively heading. So equity, it's as the slide states, it's eliminating barriers, being your authentic self, and thriving. But take a deeper dive into that. It's systems that are created or improved for people to thrive, and it might not be the same for everyone based on a number of different factors. Equity is also rooted in civil rights and ADA statutes. What I like to say to folks when I'm explaining equity and Title VI is equity is the what we're trying to achieve, and Title VI is the how. How do we operationalize? How do we ensure that equity is being a priority? But how do we get there is the big piece. So the focus here is on fairness, and it's an opportunity to take a closer look at those that are most in need of these resources while assessing how can we achieve these outcomes. Some examples include implementing programs that support customers, such as the Low Income Fair program, or increasing language access for limited English proficiency customers, to providing effective communications for persons with disabilities, to leveling the playing field for disadvantaged firms. And this is also demonstrated internally. Our internal work as it relates to our compensation study, thinking about internal equity, equal pay for equal work, which we're currently undertaking. So now next I'll move into diversity. As we all know, that there's primary and secondary dimensions, it's difference in backgrounds, perspectives, and more, but it's also synonymous with those primary dimensions of diversity as we think about whether it's race or ethnicity, color, national origin, sex, gender, sexual orientation, expression, and so forth. And it's also used as terminology related to affirmative action, planning, and initiatives such as diverse workforce or being able to diversify our workforce. And research has shown that more diverse teams outperform homogeneous groups. They're more productive, more innovative, and more profitable. Bottom line, it's a better way of doing business. We then have inclusion, where it's an action, right? Where there's intentionality behind it. We're purposeful of being able to bring folks in, and it's the process of including them and using the power of differences and similarities to achieve a common goal or objective. There's also, when we think about diversity and inclusion, there's that inclusive intelligence is what it's called, where it shows that diverse groups work harder to understand and solve problems rather than falling into groupthink, which is something that we don't want to do in order to address these complex business issues that we have. And then lastly, we have belonging. I always like, when I think about transit, I feel that all should be welcome, right? So when you welcome differing perspectives and backgrounds, whether it's employees or your constituents or the customers that we serve, being able to provide a voice and space to contribute to and support the mission of RTD through connection, avoiding othering, and restoring disability in the communities that we serve. So how does equity apply to the board of directors or the RTD service district in general? So how does equity apply to the board, but more so specifically, how does the equity lens apply to the board? So as you can see here, there's 4 bullet points with some great images. And the first one is about meeting dynamics. So given the wealth of knowledge, insight, and experience that each of you have, you all contribute to the dynamics of board meetings and workshop sessions and the like. And the dynamics of the board is influenced by the flow of communication, as well as the inclusiveness and receptivity to ideas and thoughts that are presented. The highlight here is it can be stifled by personal biases, perspectives, which we'll talk about later in this session. Next, we have policies, which can be affected by those making decisions in advisory bodies, And as you know, policy directs the work of RTD, and inequities can exist because of the policies we operate under may benefit some and may benefit or burden rather or others. So as you all know, policy development is a necessary part of creating or ensuring institutional change. We next have service delivery outcomes. RTD is required, as you are pretty well familiar with the presentation of the 2022 Title VI program update, where the board plays a vital role in providing service delivery outcomes, where we're required to provide and ensure benefits of programs and services to all. And it's our policies, practices, and programs and services, we want to make sure that they do not result in a disparate impact or treatment or inequitable outcomes for the communities that we serve. So by nature of your positions, you are often presented with Title VI service equity analyses and approving these equity analyses to ensure that there's that equitable distribution of our services that we provide on a 3 times a year during our run boards. Next, which is you're all familiar with, is community representation. This can be demonstrated through the telephone town halls, the listening sessions, but what the point that I want to raise up about community representation, it's having or providing the opportunity for those that are most impacted to be able to be seated at the table, the decision-making table, where our communities, the customers that we serve, they have a right, because they are impacted by the decisions that we make, to be involved. And when we think about providing equitable and sustainable outcomes, they are achieved by having that input and seeking out that input specifically for folks that are either historically marginalized or underrepresented. And ultimately, because they are impacted, this is something that should be top of mind. And this directly relates, I was reading through the board governance materials as it relates to the roles and responsibilities of, it's number 4 about customer and constituent representation for all in the transit district. All right, so with this slide here is, and for Director Catlin, there's a American Red Cross marketing ad that it's presented here. And at this point in time, here's that ringing that bell of participation. What stands out about this image? So we'll take a minute and you can raise your hand when you feel through your observations what stands out in this image. Director Deschelle.
There's only a lot of the not cools are pointing to people of color and people taking the not cool action. Certainly what stands out from my end. The exception of a guy drinking a beer.
Thank you, Director Deschelle. Any other takers? Director Bouquet.
Yeah, I think on the opposite end of that spectrum, I also caught that too. I see the cool. I just am realizing the cool images are of folks of folks who are just white. So that's what I'm also noticing.
Thank you.
Oh, Carl, how old is that ad? How could they have made such a glaring thing?
I'm not even real sure what some of the cool and not cool are all about. I mean, yeah, how old is that ad?
Yes,
1955.
1955. All right, so yes, Director Deschelle and Bouquet hit the nail on the head, where children of color were more likely to be labeled not cool compared to non-minorities or white folks within this poster. And that was going to be my next question is, when do you think this ad was produced? So to give up the answer, it was produced and published and distributed by the American Red Cross in 2016. And this was in the state of Colorado. So Yes, as I call these blunders. And this is something to make note of it, especially as we're thinking through that equity lens of being able to ground truth before you produce something and distribute it out. It's something to have that to apply that equity lens so you don't inadvertently impact or offend people that you're not intending to. So this could be an example of I wouldn't necessarily consider this malicious, but something that was unintended and is related to unconscious bias or having a potential bias, so to speak. And just to give an example, another example that I came across at TriMet, where they produced all these ads of women. Basically, it was a recruitment campaign of increasing women in operator or bus operator roles. And the ad said, now is the time for women to take the driver's seat, to take a lead in the driver's seat. And there was a lot of public outcry, and rightfully so, and we rescinded those posters and everything. So yeah, just being mindful of how, and I'll explain this a little bit further in the workshop, but how biases may creep up. And then secondarily, where's the quality assurance or quality checking to say, before we distribute this, let's have some eyes on it because as you think about it, could potentially damage credibility or offend folks that don't deserve to be offended in this way. So thank you for hitting the nail on the head. You removed my ability to have to explain it, and I just appreciate the candidness and frankness to nip this one in the bud. So next we'll get into awareness. So what does it mean? Self-awareness is the ability to see yourself clearly and objectively through reflection and introspection. The takeaway here, which relates to the growth mindset as we are avoiding assumptions and not generalizing, is to become self-aware by examining yourself, truly examining yourself. And to close the loop, it's about taking action based on your comfortability, right? Going through the motion or the exercises to have that self-awareness to get a better understanding how you show up in the world and what you're communicating outwardly. It's a time to reflect and ask yourself, do we have space for discomfort in disrupting the status quo? So back to the marketing ad, everyone probably gave the thumbs up and the green light, this is great, let's distribute it. But was anyone willing to raise their hand or say that's something that we shouldn't do? So it's about how do you disrupt the status quo in times of discomfort, and to raise up whether we feel that is not how I behave. If this is something that's rooted in you, and you can say this is not how I behave, or you don't make those types of jokes, how do you take a more proactive stance of interrupting that behavior? And one thing that I like to communicate is the standards that you're willing to accept is the standard that you're willing to accept, right? Are you on the notion of turning a blind eye when you see something that needs to be course corrected, right? So depending on your comfortability level and depending on where you sit, how do you go about disrupting the status quo? Some pro tips, which I mentioned, is avoiding those assumptions and generalizations. And one thing to think about on the board or just RTD in general is we apply a lot of different rules and policies, right? And are we deviating from that process, and are we applying it differently across different decisions that are being made? And how does that impact folks that we serve or the decisions that we make that could have essentially an impact on our community? So at this point in time, it's a exercise, so to speak. I will now pass it over to Vivian for the social identity survey.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carl. Directors, you received an email earlier from the board office with 2 links. Please look up that email and click on the link one called Social Identity Surveys. Once you click on that, you will be redirected to a form which has a non-exhaustive list of social identities, i.e. lenses that one may use in daily life. Please rank these social identities in the order that you may consider these lenses as you make decisions in your day-to-day. And as a reminder, the responses are completely anonymous, so we encourage you to be as candid as possible. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And Carl is telling me that you actually need to stop sharing the screen in order for me to take it over. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, thank you. All right, so we see answers starting to come in. That's great. I believe we have about 10 directors on the call. Is that the number we're aiming towards?
Yes, I believe so.
Perfect.
Got 11.
11, thank you.
Got 12.
Oh, look at us.
Yay.
But one with no internet. So probably 11.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I'll give you about 30 more seconds to let a few that are finishing up.
Hey, it's not that easy.
It is, it's a little tricky, yes, agreed. All right, for the convenience of time, I'm just gonna go ahead and start debriefing a little, but if you have not finished, if you have not put it in, just feel free to hit that submit button. So we can see that it looks like the top 3 over here are occupation, parent, guardian, or caregiver, and race, ethnicity, and national origin. So you are all 10 individuals that answered this on an individual level. However, when you come together, you are a board of directors, and whether conscious and unconsciously, perhaps the top 3 lenses are the lenses that you use when you make decisions, when you come in together as a board of directors. And that is totally fine. The invitation from this exercise is, as a governing group, how can you be aware that these are your lenses and maximize these lenses for when you're making decisions, yet also realize that you may not be conscious and or inclusive of other lenses by a way that you are not even realizing it. And how can you be more aware as you keep moving forward to be inclusive of these lenses that may not come to you as intuitively as the collective occupation, parent, guardian, caregiver, or race, ethnicity, national origin. Again, this is a non-exhaustive list. There are clearly plenty of more lenses, but it's a good place to start as you keep moving forward through this work. Back to you, Carl.
Thank you. Let me pull up this slide. All right, so yes, thanks again for participating in this survey. And thank you, Vivian, for facilitating that. All right, so let's take a look and get a better understanding of social identities. So pulling from extant research, the social identity theory was first introduced by a couple of social psychologists in the 1970s, and it describes the cognitive processes related to social identity and how social identity impacts intergroup behavior. So part of this work examined the way perceptual processes resulted in social stereotypes and prejudice. Many of us were taught that our norms and social experiences are the way it should be. So we react or tend to react negatively when we see something outside of our experience. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's different. But that's not how we should react when we might say something like, hey, that's just wrong. This reaction does not mean you are a sexist or a racist or any of those other isms, which is defined as an explicit bias, but it may reveal, as Vivian alluded to, that unconscious or implicit bias in which translates into wrong, to that wrong category. And to raise awareness of how diversity and inclusion influence relationships, it can help build capabilities throughout the organization. And you have to understand, or we have to collectively understand, when your unconscious bias comes into play, that is something that we should have top of mind. And it's one of those defining aspects of self-awareness. So I know I brought up the term bias quite a bit, and some of you are very familiar with bias, but we'll go ahead and break it down in this next slide. So overall, what is a bias? It's the tendency to either favor or disfavor something. It is the judgment that human beings rely on to make those snap decisions. And these mental associations are so well established that they can operate without awareness, intention, or control. And our biases effectively shape how we interact, how we communicate, and how we go about doing or operating in our normal lives. So as the definition states here, for explicit or conscious bias, it's aware that one has a particular thought or feeling, but may or may not understand the source. Much of the time, these biases and their expression arise as the direct result of a perceived threat. And when people feel threatened, they're more likely to draw group boundaries to distinguish themselves from others. And when people perceive their biases to be valid, they're more likely to justify whether it be unfair treatment. And as we know, it can have long-term negative impacts. Director Tisdale.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, just because this is relates to a discussion that I had on October the 9th with our previous facilitator in talking about these issues. And I appreciate the use of the word unconscious in quotes under implicit, because my problem is this. By definition, a judgment by you that someone has a bias, that is, has an implicit bias, is only your judgment. It is your implication. Implicit bias is a subjective assessment made by the observer. It is not an insight into the mind of the individual being observed. And that's why the word unconscious bias or inherent bias or intrinsic bias might work, but I think the use of the word implicit bias is a bastardization of the language. Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that, Director Tisdale. And as we know, with nomenclature and what's set before us as far as the schools of thought or the pioneers, if you will, in setting forth these definitions, I can see where you're standing from as far as implicit, where it relates to something that's implied by whether it be the person that is doing it rather than the observer. So there is some, by virtue of your sentiments there, I do somewhat agree as far as the vernacular that is used in the description underneath it. So I appreciate that comment. Director Deschelle.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to push back on Director Tisdale a bit and use this as an opportunity to employ a growth mindset, because different communities use different words to mean different things, and that can be hard, especially for those of us in the legal profession. But to keep in mind that things like Merriam-Webster's dictionary and things like that are upheld by those who are in power, and those who are holding the power, right? White supremacist, white dominant culture of who sets those definitions, who decides what those definitions are, and that by really trying to sit there and mince words is a way to remove yourself from what's really at issue here, right? Which is that someone has observed that a bias exists, and that when you're the person who is in a position of power, it is on you to take a step back and say, well, let me check myself on what that bias might be and make an assessment, as opposed to saying, Well, that's just your observation, right? And it goes back to the intent versus impact. So I know you were just trying to make a point about language, but I think it's important. Language is really important, and who holds power is really important. And the impact that language has and how language can be weaponized by those who are in power is just something that I think we need to keep in mind and not get so caught up on, well, what word did you use versus the impact that it has and the biases, the unconscious, to use an agreed term, biases that we may have.
Thank you, Director Giselle. Director Tisdale?
Yes, just a right of reply. Words matter. I've heard that a lot. So for that reason, I do think it's important. And I'm not disputing the idea that there could be inherent bias or intrinsic bias or unconscious bias. I just protest against the use of the word implicit, because I think it takes our focus off of the issue at heart, which you addressed, which is, what about the unconscious bias? Can we all stop and take a moment to reflect upon that? We've spent too long on the issue, but I felt compelled as a bit of a linguist to bring it forward. Thank you.
No, and I appreciate that, Director Tisdale. I'm just thinking about our meeting agreements of respecting differences, and this was a prime time example of being able to have this conversation in a respectful and dignified way. So I appreciate you both for the exchange and correspondence of information. So thank you both for sharing. And I now am compelled, before I get into the definition of unconscious or implicit bias, where I was faced with a bias, and I'll get more into this a little bit later about microaggressions, so I also serve in the Air National Guard, and this was in the Oregon Air National Guard, and thinking about power and so forth, where it was after hours, and I ended up meeting with the wing commander, who's a colonel, and then his vice commander, and then their chief exec. And we're just having a conversation, and one person, I won't give names or anything like that, but one person stated, "Oh, why are you here so late?" And then another person mentioned, "Oh, it's because your teammate, if you will, he was the director, I was the superintendent of equal opportunity, and this was a month into the job." And he goes, "Oh, it's because Captain X is a slave driver." And because of their unconscious bias, they may not have, that's something that has been programmed or a terminology that they've utilized. So it's something that they're comfortable with saying. But I, on the receiving end, I play two parts, right? So I show up as the person that I am, that is multicultural, multiracial, ethnic, so on and so forth. But I also, my credibility as an equal opportunity professional, I needed to raise it up. One, it's a CYA for the commander, because if there was someone else that was walking through and they heard that, that could diminish his credibility. So my role as the equal opportunity professional is to raise awareness on this very subject of bias or microaggression. And I immediately the next day called upon a meeting, and it could have been both ways. When we're thinking about power, I was a E7 master sergeant, or no, tech sergeant at the time. This is all rank structure, so forth. Some may get it, some may not. But essentially I was enlisted, and there's officers. And there's a power dynamic where, it could run the risk of reprisal or retaliation, and that floated through my head. But he was receptive 100% and very apologetic, very remorseful. And he basically thanked me on bringing this to his attention. And it was something that he was able to embed within his fabric, if you will, to go, I'm going to course correct this moving forward. I apologize. That wasn't my intention at all. So that's something where something that's out of your control, by definition of this, unaware of a bias, and it happens out of one's control, right? And it happens automatically, and it's triggered by one's brain to make a quick judgment or assessment, or just to blurt out something that may not necessarily be culturally competent. So, and to that point, when we think about our brain, it's a remarkable organ, right? It makes over 1,000 different processes, or takes in 1,000 different processes per second. And based off that information, we make decisions every day, right? Whether it's eating lunch, showing up to this work session while also thinking about potentially the Colorado Avalanche game to what have you. So, but also when we think about this powerful organ, it's also can be considered lazy, right? When we think about what happens is the brain creates shortcuts, right? We're naturally processing information and we create shortcuts, we create categories in order to expedite the process or streamline it. And these shortcuts are often tied to these unconscious biases, so it's easier for our brain to categorize information and we make snap judgments. So when we think about there's so many different biases. I believe the number as of right now, there's over 150 different unconscious biases. And some examples could be confirmation bias, which is a tendency to search for, interpret information in a way that confirms one's perception, to the bandwagon bias, when you adopt a belief just because more people hold that belief, and it can lead to groupthink. And that's something when we're thinking about ideas and innovation and creativity, that bandwagon bias can stifle that creativity and really enable us to be able to think outside the box and come up with creative solutions. And then we also have another example is the anchoring bias. And it's the tendency to rely heavily on one piece of information. It's often the first thing that we hear when making decisions. These, I'm just naming off a couple that are prevalent, that could be prevalent during board meetings or even just normal processes at RTD, is being cognizant of these types of biases so we don't fall into these biasy traps, if you will. Director Williams.
Yeah, there's also the term bias is used in cloth, and I think that might be the origin of it. And it is the tendency to go at a 45-degree angle to the weave of the bulk of the cloth, and it allows for flexing and stretching. So bias isn't all a negative implication.
Yes, and I would also offer up too, I thank you for providing that additional definition. You always learn something new every day in addition to the information that's being presented here tonight. And biases aren't necessarily, I mean, we all have them, they're not necessarily a bad thing, but when they impact others, that's where we need to be cognizant of the fact that if we are unconsciously or consciously using a bias, that's something that we want to have top of mind to ensure that it doesn't impact folks that may be inadvertently impacted.
Yeah, it's just, I want to point out, it's not always negative. I have a bias towards speaking, regardless of what the topic is. The other directors can tell you that. So I see everybody's laughing, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I just want to point out that there are biases that are negative, biases that are explicit, biases that are implicit, and biases that are just part of who you are.
Yes, I appreciate that, Director Williams. All right, so the question is not, do I have a bias? So to tee this slide up, there's going to be a series of words and it'll be a progression. And what I would like to ask for each of you is just take a mental note of what comes up for you internally. And it won't be shared, we're not sharing, but it's just take a mental note of what comes up for you. So the point of sharing all of these was not to overwhelm you, but to help demonstrate that unconscious bias affects or impacts virtually every area of difference among people. So the question is, it's not whether or not we have unconscious biases ourselves, because as humans, we all have them. The question is, which one are ours? So that's something just to take a mental note of, and that's essentially it, just to take a mental note and to take that time to reflect on what comes up, and that's it. All right, so how does bias affect our actions? So it can affect our attention, how we see people and perceive reality, our attitude, how we react towards certain people, our behaviors, how receptive or friendly we are towards certain people, our attention, again, which aspects of a person we pay most particular attention to, our filter, how much we actively listen to what certain people say, and our micro affirmations, which is how much or how little we comfort certain people in certain situations. The point being is, first, we must embrace the fact that it is normal to hold these unconscious preferences and biases, so to speak. And second, to realize that those preferences and biases influence most, if not all, of the decisions that we make, and particularly as they regard people. So these unconscious feelings play a strong part in influencing our judgment of whom we consider as others. So what does bias look like? So taking a chapter from Dr. Kevin Nadal, microaggressions, and this is something that I brought up earlier or a few slides ago. And just to, by definition of microaggressions, it's defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias or negative attitude toward historically marginalized groups. The difference between microaggressions and overt discrimination or macroaggressions is the people who commit microaggressions might not even be aware of them. And they happen casually, frequently, and often without any harm intended in everyday life. So to tee up the next slide, which I'll pass back over to Vivian, is we're going to do a microaggression exercise.
Thank you, Carl. Directors, please refer back to the email that the board office sent earlier and click on link to microaggressions exercise. Once you get to this form, you will find a text box. Please type in examples of microaggressions that you may have witnessed and or experienced. You may submit as many examples as you would like. We understand that this exercise could be a trigger, so please engage at the level that you may feel comfortable. Again, all the answers are anonymous, so we encourage you to be as candid as possible. Give you a few minutes to start doing that. Is that your natural hair? Where are you from? Should listen to people more intently. Speaking softly to someone who is hard of hearing. People making fun of those with disabilities, people thinking older adults are not tech savvy, people thinking women are less capable, people thinking, let's open that up, skin color determines intelligence. Offensive vocabulary that was once generally accepted, judging people's eating habits based on weight. Saying to a person of color, you are so articulate. Assuming he, him, his when a CEO, lawyer, doctor, and other position are referred to. People blaming RTD for societal issues, ignoring women's comments. Give you another 15 seconds and then we can wrap this up. Rolling eyes when someone tells you what their pronouns are, aggression to authority. Over solicitousness for a young person. Going to a more junior person in a meeting who may be from a dominant background when the more senior person is from an underrepresented background. Describing folks of color as aggressive. I will start with a debrief, but if you have any others, please feel free to keep submitting them. First, I want to start with thanking you all for being very candid and willing to share. This exercise does require a bit of vulnerability, and I appreciate that you were willing to go there with us. So thank you. As you can see from these examples, they feel weird, right? As I was reading them, we're in a virtual room, and even the virtual room feels tense, right? So what do we do about this when we're in real life and you witness something like this? It's hard. How do I interrupt this, right? Do we call it out? Do we disrupt it? Do I even have the tools or the language to disrupt it? So that's a conversation we're gonna have next. Like, we all experience these microaggressions, whether we witness them or experience them ourselves. And like Carl said, it's about interrupting it. So how do we do that? I will turn it over to Carl to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Vivian. All right, so here's another opportunity before we get into some of the tools and resources. The question is, do I have a bias? So the Harvard has a link that we've already previously shared. We won't be doing it tonight, but this is an opportunity to get an understanding of what biases that you may have. Because as we think about interrupting or disrupting, or how do we start from within in order to go outward, it's having that self-awareness, as we mentioned earlier. And this is a tool, if you will, to take that first step if you haven't completed it already. And the results is directly between yourself and Harvard. So this is a planting of the seed of encouraging you all to take this test. It's under the Project Implicit, and the website link can be provided if it hasn't already. So what to do about bias? So it's about openly acknowledging and challenging biases, which allows us to develop strategic interventions. It's about understanding your own biases towards inaction and being able to decide on the action and timing that is right for you. We are encouraged to take action to support or advocate on behalf of a, so to speak, non-dominant group or group member. Next point is having that intention, being purposefully driven to acknowledge what you may harbor as unconscious bias and having the ability to be motivated by change. You're bringing forth attention where you may pay attention to your triggers and know when stereotypical responses to assumptions that are activated. So just by virtue of the anonymous results, I saw examples of biases, of stereotypes, and specifically microaggressions. So being able to call that out, you are aware, to Vivian's points, either you experienced it directly or you may observe this. So how do you interrupt this? And another point is time, right? It takes time to be able to interrupt and to build the tools necessary in order to either check your biases or check other biases that you are presented with or that you may overhear or see based on the interactions that you have. So by taking the time to practice new strategies designed to break your automatic associations that link to a negative judgment to behavior that is culturally different from yours. So again, having intention, bringing attention to those triggers, and then also setting forth the time needed to practice strategies and intervention tactics. So here are some productive ways to keep your biases in check. Evidence shows that it is very difficult. It can be very difficult to change unconscious bias, but it is possible to change behaviors that are shaped by biases. Pressing rewind to that slide about growth mindset, this is something that you can move forward with. Most people want to be fair, and if they are made aware of their biases, many will use these cognitive processes to prevent biases from shaping their decisions and behaviors. So it's about mastering your biases through awareness. And I always, as I mentioned before, it's about starting from within in order to course correct those types of biases and outward facing. The next is will yourself to think a specific way. So it's important to point out that interrupting implicit biases requires self-motivation, and that's why it's nearly impossible to make someone confront their bias. So when we think about willing yourself in a specific way, it's about, when we think about self-directed neuroplasticity, to train your brain to think in that certain way. And it's the ability of your brain to reorganize itself both physically and functionally rather. Through mindfulness meditation, there's different opportunities. There's a number of resources and podcasts where you can achieve that level of brain, or basically that level of brain shaping that allows you to think differently and eventually counteract your biases. As we mentioned, the brain can be lazy, but we can take control and begin to change our neurons and synapses to achieve objective thoughts through these processes. And next, it's about team diversity, being able to bring various opinions, experiences, values, and goals to the table. And it's the opportunity to avoid those traps, as I mentioned earlier, of these cognitive biases. So the question is, are you willing to interrupt? So here again is a time, it's an invitation for reflection and awareness. And one thing to note is when we're thinking about interrupting someone, it's really centered on your tone, right? Where a tactic, if you will, is to say, what did you mean by that? Versus, what did you exactly mean by that? Where it could be off-putting, especially when you're attempting to interrupt, and it's all about the how, right? I say this a lot, it's all about the how. How are you coming across? How are you communicating that is truly going to lend a hand in what you're trying to achieve as far as interrupting biases, stereotypes, and the like. And another tactic, if you will, or a question to ask is, what point are you trying to make by saying that? And then another tactic, if you will, is reframing the negative stereotype. The key here is to reframe the negative thought into a positive affirmation that more accurately reflects reality. So let's give an example here. So if someone says, accommodating people with disabilities is very inconvenient and not justified. So the way to reframe this is, people with disabilities have the right to accommodations and should be granted accommodations whenever they are needed. Accommodations are not an inconvenience, and they are 100% justified because they allow people with disabilities to access equal experiences and offer greater perspective. The next is ask questions to gain understanding. If you hear something, say something. Pulling a little tagline from our security side of things, see something, say something. But really it's about getting an understanding of where are they coming from, and asking secondary, tertiary questions such as, can you tell me more by what you mean? And depending on what was communicated, really getting an understanding of where they sit and what biases or stereotypes may be prevalent, and how do you unpack that, if you will, and having that conversation either reframe or provide that invitation for reflection and awareness. The next one is support and correct, right? As I mentioned before, we're all on different starting blocks. And if you think about the spectrum of the journey into equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, some folks may not have that background or that experience into it. And it's okay, and that's okay, but it's always an opportunity to interject yourself into the conversation, and by supporting that person to the extent possible. Some folks may not want to change, but having that courage to say something is a step in the right direction. So one thing that I mentioned, for example, is just being able to use I statements and appealing to logic. When you reflect back and you put it back on yourself, how it has impacted you, or how it may impact folks that are not necessarily there, this is something that you would want to utilize. I mean, we've all heard I statements, but then 1.2 is just to appeal to logic. I know oftentimes where it could be uncomfortable, there could be a lot of tension, depending on a number of different circumstances, where I liked, at least from my vantage point, I would remove the emotion from it and be objective and appealing to logic and on fact. And that sub bullet, avoid humor. This more often than not always backfires. So if you're interrupting someone to make light of the situation, it may not be a good thing to use humor. But I know that could be a response for some if there's feeling of, if you're uncomfortable where you may laugh at the joke, but it's something that may perpetuate, or you may be complicit in that bias or that microaggression. Director Tisdale.
Thank you. I have to express sadness over that last point, to avoid humor. And I'm sure there is probably some research that supports that, but I just find it troubling because humor quite often, not always, but quite often can help diffuse a tense situation. So it's sad that we have come to the conclusion that our lives are somehow going to be better if we remove humor from them.
Thank you for that response, Director Tisdale. And just as a caveat, what we mean by as far as the avoiding humor, knowing that some natural reaction to things may make you laugh or giggle or add humor into it. So again, circling back to the how, and depending on who's in the room, so to speak, when we think about humor, it shouldn't be at the expense of someone. That's what I mean by that, where if there's a group of folks and we're all laughing at that same joke and we're all adding in, you're complicit, and there could be someone that takes offense or is offended by that microaggression, or may feel that, oh, I didn't know that person supports this, right? So that's what I mean by avoiding humor in that sense. Director Busick.
Yeah, thanks. And this is one that I have trouble with, I think, on a personal level, for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm usually busy enough trying to figure out if I'm that guy. If I'm the problem, are my biases impacting others? And I try to be self-reflective. And if I'm tied up thinking about that, it's really hard to think about, oh, that person said something inappropriate. I need to jump in and say something. And it can also be dangerous, and not necessarily physically dangerous, but depending on the setting that you're in. I mean, you could then become, oh yeah, there's Busick, he's going to be the one that's going to correct everything you say, and suddenly you're marginalized for trying to stop this microaggression or whatever it was going on. So that's a double-edged sword. I don't know, that's a tough one.
No, and I appreciate that, Director Busick or Chair Busick. And again, it's an ongoing journey. And as I mentioned before, I've made mistakes along the way, and the way that I approach things are a lot differently, or have been a lot differently for a number of years, but it didn't start out that way because of the sentiments and the realities of what you mentioned, where it's better to go along to get along. And as I've became, or in the profession of the work that I do in my life's work, I felt the impetus that I need to say something regardless of the outcome, but I approach it differently. It may not be in a group setting. It could be taking pause, hearing it, and then having a follow-up conversation with that person. And I remember taking a green dot training, and it had to do with sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military. And depending on your comfortability and how you respond to things, is do you go towards the heat, where if there's conflict and you like conflict and are okay with it and you can operate in it, then that's your approach. But if you're conflict avoidant or what have you, your response may not be, and it's not wrong. It's not wrong. That's just who you are. But the point to make out is, as you as we continuously go on this journey of managing our expectations as it relates to biases and stereotypes, is to really sit in it and take that moment, take that reflection. And there may come a time where you feel compelled to say something for becoming an ally or an accomplice, to be able to stand up for a person or group that may not be in the majority, to be able to say that. So I wouldn't say we should be condemned for not saying something, but getting in the habit to flex that muscle of being comfortable, being able to say something when the time is right for you.
Yeah, I like your analogy of the ally or an accomplice, right? So you can be an ally and help. If you don't say anything, maybe you're an accomplice and you're complicit. So interesting. Thanks.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And the last piece too, it's being open to feedback, right? So why do I feel uncomfortable with the feedback that I'm receiving? So this is something, if someone is correcting you, why do you feel uncomfortable with the feedback that you're receiving? So this tees up for the next slide here, which I'll pass back over to Vivian.
Thank you so much. This is our final exercise of the evening. So as we're talking about interrupting, interrupt feels like a big word, right? It feels like it's stopping everything and moving on. But it can be as simple as reframing our words and using inclusive language instead of regular language. For example, as Carl was mentioning, we have been ingrained in this culture and we have all these phrases and all these idioms that are ingrained and they're just normal. And when you actually start thinking about them, they feel that they could be a little offensive to some groups or exclusive instead of including people and making people feel like they belong. So I'm just gonna ask for you to just popcorn out, just unmute yourself and give me some examples of a word or a phrase that we may be using that might not be the best word, and what could be a better way, an inclusive way of referring to that. And I'll give you a first example. For example, we sometimes say waiter or waitress, and we don't mean much by that. But the implication is that someone is waiting on you, that you are super important and someone is waiting on you and this person is slower than you and they are waiting. So maybe a better word to use now is server, right? It's someone that is serving you and it's helping you along the way. So we're not talking about earth-shattering words here. We're talking about just simple language, inclusive language. Any thoughts, Ms. Director Williams?
Yes, we don't say seniors anymore, unless you're talking about a senior pilot or a senior transportation planner. We say older adults.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Director Deschelle.
Grandfathered in.
Mm-hmm. What would be a better way of saying that?
Continue to include.
Continued, exempted maybe? You don't have to give specific criteria because you've already been exempted given some pre-existing conditions. Perfect.
Also,
legacy. Sorry, Carl. I was just saying we use legacy as well for grandfather.
Legacy, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thumbs up. That was the word I was going to say.
Oh, nice.
Excellent.
Mimi, we don't say homeless anymore. Homeless is out. We say unhoused.
Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much. I would just add to the seniors category. Actually, I prefer to say the age advantaged.
I'll make a note. Any other words that you may think of?
Various terms affiliated with mentally handicapped. I know neurodivergent is much more often used.
Along those lines, I can add, we say when something feels a little crazy, we can, because of that, we can also say that I'm overwhelmed. When we're talking about our kids or grandkids, you have lots of energy. One or two more. And if we don't have them, that's okay, but it at least is planting the seed of, hey, these are words that we have used for a while, that they're ingrained in our system, and we use them and we make mistakes and they come out and we say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I did not mean it like that at all. So how can we be a little more aware on using inclusive language and making sure that what we're saying includes and makes people feel like they belong instead of excluding them?
Yeah, we
Because we're
don't say
not-
RTD directors, we say pobrecitos.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I'm gonna give it back to you, Carl.
Thank you so much. So this is going through this exercise and just hearing some of the do's and don'ts as it relates to inclusivity. This is one of those opportunities that we have tonight to be able to exercise our muscle and have collective knowledge on what are some outdated terms where they should be replaced with inclusive terms. So thank you very much, Vivian, for walking us through this exercise, and I appreciate the participation. All right, so now we're going to step into perspective, but before I continue, I just wanted to say we only have a couple more slides, so we're almost through this amazing equity, diversity, and inclusion belonging workshop, so I appreciate the participation. So I'm gonna borrow a definition from my friend, Noah Webster, and brothers George and Charles Merriam, Webster Merriam Dictionary. So when we think about perspective, it's a mental view or prospect and the capacity to view things in their true relations or relative importance. And in order to broaden our perspective, we need to examine oneself, be more self-aware, and intentionally take action. And here are a couple of ways to broaden your perspective. The first is perspective taking. It involves stepping into the shoes of a stereotyped person. What does it feel like? And ask yourself, what does it feel like to have your intelligence automatically questioned, or to be trailed by police or detectives each time that you walk into a store? Perspective taking can be very useful in assessing the emotional impact on individuals who are constantly being stereotyped in negative ways. It is also a way to checking oneself if you begin to judge a person, whether it be by the color of their skin, or if they're thinking about gender expression or gender identity or religious faith. It's how are you reacting in a particular way because of the person that you come across or interact with. Another one is about reassociation. So this is stereotype replacement. An individual recognizes that he or she or they is responding to a situation or person in a stereotypical fashion. They may consider the reasons and actively replaces this biased response with an unbiased one, such as Black students are loud and disruptive. A way to reframe this is African-American students are enthusiastic and energetic. Next we have refuting, which is counter stereotypic imagining. So it's once a person recognizes that she, he, or they are stereotyped, what do you think, what are examples that prove the stereotype to be, how do you prove that stereotype to be inaccurate? Director Tisdale.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to jump in on one part there because that does kind of drive me crazy sometimes when you reframe the comment about African-American students are loud, and then you said, they're energetic. My response is, Fred is loud, Barney is loud, Betty is quiet, Wilma is loud. It's the person that we're talking about. And I get very uncomfortable, even if we're trying to state it in a more positive way, in effect, stereotyping people. And saying, well, these African-American students are energetic. I think Fred or Barney or Betty, might be labeled that way, and maybe Wilma is not, but it's the individual that I believe, that we should be talking about and not trying to categorize people in any way. But perhaps that's a personal bias on my part, and I just get concerned when we take what's an inappropriate stereotype and try to, pardon the expression, whitewash it, which refers to paint, not to color. So I just have a concern about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Director Tisdale. So the point being for what this is really talking about, and you're right, as far as in the sense of naming the person, rather, does someone have a natural inclination to stereotype a protected class or characteristic of a person? That's what we're really talking about here. I have an example. I worked at Bonneville Power Administration in Portland, Oregon, and a coworker was describing a person in human resources, and she went through a diatribe of explaining this person, and then she goes, you know, the black one. And I asked the question, what do you mean by that? What that has nothing to do with it, even just by virtue of your description of the name, the title of his position and what he does. I automatically knew, why was there an added descriptor of that person, right? Why is that needed? And so that's one example. And just thinking about, is someone naturally inclined to have a stereotype, and stereotype someone that could have a potentially detrimental impact, or it may harm or offend someone, is what we're really alluding to. Is how do you, if someone says something that has the natural inclination to say Black folks are loud or something to that effect, that's an opportunity for that person, whether it's yourself or myself, to be able to interrupt that and reframe what that person said, or just nip it in the bud and say, why do we need to describe folks in that way? I sit on the part of going towards the heat, and I like to have great conversations to address it, but some folks may not. So how do you reframe it in a way that is maybe not necessarily going towards the heat? So I appreciate that input, Dr. Tisdale. So the last one is, as far as gaining more perspective, it's increasing the opportunity for positive impact. So what do we mean by that? So it's, in order to reduce implicit bias, is to actively seek out situations where one is unlikely to be exposed to positive examples of whether it be a protected class or someone that is different from yourself. So that's garnering perspective and understanding to potentially mitigate those stereotypes that you may have. Again, we all have stereotypes, we all have biases, but how do we course correct and nip it in the bud, especially if there is a harmful impact on folks. So that essentially is perspective, which I'll now move into the last couple of slides. So I'd like to ask the question, who is right in this scenario?
Everybody.
You hit the nail on the head, right? So they're both looking at it from different vantage points, but they're both correct. Another example that I wanted to bring up that I have top of mind, and I mentioned this to Vivian, is the example of an orange and two kids walking into a store or a convenience store, and there's only one orange left in that produce aisle. And next thing you know, the attendant hears bickering and people being overwhelmed and acting in a certain way and yelling, saying, I want this orange, this is the last one. So the attendant walks over, why are you all arguing? The first customer, a boy, mentioned, I want this orange because my mother would like to use these orange peels for happy hour this evening, and she wants them to make cocktails. The other child mentions, well, I need the orange because my grandmother is going to make orange juice in the morning. So they were fixated on the intended use of that orange and why they needed that last orange, right? And the question that was asked by the attendant is, what do you need it for? So they both offered that up, and he goes, y'all are both right in the sense of wanting this orange and the why behind it. But what we can do here is, how about I peel the orange, you can have the orange peel, and you can have the orange. Now you both have what you want. So the takeaway here is just having and garnering that perspective and truly understanding what that need or what that want is in order to have perspective on those. So that's something that I just wanted to offer up. All right, so this slide here. What you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. And this is something that was pulled from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And this quote is salient to RTD's goal of trustworthiness, where we will be forthright in our actions, we will do what we say, and we will say when we do it. So as a wrap up, I just wanted to communicate that as we progress through these slides, when we introduce the having a common understanding or foundational knowledge of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, getting a snapshot or understanding of biases, stereotypes, and microaggressions, and how do we garner perspective, how do we interrupt microaggressions and the like, it's again, an iterative process, and it takes time, and it takes space. So affording yourself that grace to be able to say, I may not know everything now, but one day I will be able to meet the moment, rather. I'll be able to meet the moment in order to become that ally for folks that are historically underrepresented, to be able to bring forth lenses to our work or our body of work that we provide for the communities that we serve. And just thinking about the whys that y'all put forth as it relates to why you're serving on the board. There's so many beautiful things that you said, and I just wanted to highlight the fact that I'm so happy to be part of RTD and knowing that we have the board of directors being able to provide that strategic direction as it relates to our mission, vision, and values. And collectively, we will do the right thing, and we will ensure that our system where everyone is welcomed and we're making decisions that will have the greatest impact for times to come. So with that being said, I just wanted to say thank you all on behalf of the Civil Rights Division. We appreciate you all. Chair Busick.
Thanks, Carl. And unless there are other questions or comments, I think there will be, but so I'll start. I want to thank you for taking this task on. I know Deborah and I talked about this for some time, and directors Bouquet and Deschelle and Lewis were also involved in these discussions and bringing this forward. It was well done. It was concise, understandable, and really appreciated how you kept bringing it back to our work as directors and not just an amorphous kind of a concept. So I really appreciate that, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Director Rosenthal.
Thank you, Carl. Really appreciate this very much. So I'm curious about how a lot of what we discussed, particularly about bias and how that might intersect with Title VI and in regards to how we do our work as a board and how we make our decisions, particularly on the run boards, and how we can look through that lens of making sure that we are not biased and how we make those decisions. And obviously your job and your position is really key in making sure that that you were working with us on that. Thank you.
I appreciate the question, Director Rosenthal. So the beauty of Title VI, and y'all just recently approved the 2022 Title VI program, where there's policies and standards that we set before us to provide that quality assurance, quality check mechanism through these key evaluation tools, such as the service equity analyses, the fair equity analyses, and service monitoring reports. It's already baked in, meaning the presentations or the analysis and the reports that I provide to the board of directors, because it's a two-part piece. One is the staff completing the report, but it's the role of the board of directors to ultimately approve of this equity analysis. And by virtue of the FTA, prior to the agency moving forward with a decision as it relates to service changes, fare changes, facility sightings, and the like, is the board must be made aware, approve of this equity analysis. And another piece to the equity analysis is the community engagement, right? Whether it's from the constituents that you serve and being able to funnel that information, because equally as important is the equity analysis is the community engagement. So those in lockstep provide the opportunity for the board to hear that holistically, and how are we distributing our services or our programs, initiatives in a way that is holistic and from a system-wide perspective, specifically focused on, because there's public law statutes or federal statutes, Title VI, where we are required to ensure that there's that equitable distribution. So I do appreciate that question, and as it relates to biases, as we're having these discussions on run boards and so forth, how does your bias, or does it play a factor in truly hearing what our communities are saying, but also what the analysis is showing? Because I could tell you that we take a fine tooth and nail is the adage maybe, but we judiciously look at these analyses to ensure that there's that equitable distribution. But even before that, working with Jesse and his team, the service development team, on ensuring that there's parity in the way that we are rolling out service. So I appreciate that question.
Thanks. And Carl, I see Director Catlin has her hand raised. Director Catlin, you're still muted.
Hi, Carl, thank you for the presentation. It was great. I was not able to participate in surveys, but I thought it was a great presentation. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. That looks like all the comments. And Vivian, I apologize. Thank you so much as well. And I really enjoyed the exercises were great, and seeing that analytic right up front was very interesting. So thanks for all your help as well. And with that being said, we'll close the meeting out at 7:25 p.m. And thanks directors and staff and everybody else that was here tonight. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.